Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
Today, we're going to be discussing a topic that we've touched on in the past, but is fundamental to the conservation planning and habitat management that we do for waterfowl during the non-breeding period. Specifically, we're going to be digging into a bit of detail on carrying capacity, foraging threshold, maybe a little bioenergetic modeling, really exciting stuff. And in season 3 of the DU podcast, I believe it was episode 17. It was released in September of 2020, if my sleuthing here is correct. We discussed duck energy days. Most of our hunters that are out there listening to this and have read DU magazines or have done any kind of research into habitat management for waterfowl will have probably at some point stumbled upon that phrase, duck energy days, and how it's used. And we have an opportunity here to follow up on that conversation and learn a little more about some of the recent science that has been conducted to understand one of the more specific components of bioenergetic modeling, that being something known as a giving up density or a foraging threshold. And we're going to get into all the details, the nitty-gritty of that. To help us with this conversation, I'm happy to welcome back to the podcast a previous guest on the show, Dr. Heath Hagy, waterfowl ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System in the Southeast region. Heath?
Thanks, Mike.
It's great to have you back.
I appreciate it.
You, as I mentioned before, you and I have been in the same sphere of waterfowl research. You and I both have done, as through our past work, have investigated various aspects of bioenergetic models for waterfowl conservation planning. That's a big part of what you do now. Mm-hmm. And it was a huge part of what I did when I was working for the Gulf Coast Joint Venture. But your research in particular dug deeply into one specific parameter. I mean, you learned a lot more, right? But one specific parameter in our bioenergetic models, and it relates to foraging thresholds, the point at which, and you're going to talk about all this, but basically, or giving up density, the point at which birds stop foraging in a given area. But let's start at a pretty high level here. When we do habitat management for wildlife in general, we're trying to affect resources that the animals need, right? And we can kind of go back to a concept of carrying capacity, as sort of a foundational component of understanding what we need to do to support desired populations of any group of animals. Where does carrying capacity come into play? What is it, and why is that sort of an important concept to understand?
Thanks, Mike. Happy to do so. So we'll just start as simply as we can. Carrying capacity, I would say, simply the number of animals that an area can support at any given time. So if we think about a region like the Delta of Arkansas or the Delta region of Mississippi, there are only so many mallards that area, or let's say dabbling ducks, there are only so many dabbling ducks that area can support because there are space limitations. There's only so many wetlands that are there during the winter. There's only so much food in those wetlands. And so the carrying capacity is basically that maximum number of animals that we can support given the resources. And so if you don't have enough resources, food, space, water, other things, then that'll be to the detriment of all of those birds. And birds will have to move somewhere else, or they might die. For instance, they might be more susceptible to harvest if there's not enough resources. So that's kind of simply the way I like to think about carrying capacity. It's just the number of animals that we can support in any given place and at any given time.
Could we also think about it in terms of, let's say, available nest sites? If we wanted to think about breeding season, the carrying capacity for breeding group of birds or waterfowl?
Absolutely, and there have been many studies on waterfowl. What's the carrying capacity in our nest sites? It's not just physical space for a bird to put a nest, but then also how many small wetlands are around there. So when all those birds hatch, and we have broods running around the landscape trying to find food in those wetlands, we want to make sure that there are enough little wetlands. And so there's only so many breeding pairs, for instance, that an acre of prairie in North Dakota can support.
So that is a critical concept for understanding the basis of habitat conservation and habitat management, habitat enhancement, restoration. if we understand this concept, and if we have population targets, if we have, well, for waterfowl, as we've talked about on a previous episode, an understanding of the number of waterfowl that we want to support on refuges or in the southeastern U.S. or in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, the next critical step there would be what? Identifying the most limiting resource.
Yeah, it's a good question. In the National Wildlife Refuge System, what we try really hard to do is not be the limiting factor. We want to make sure that as best as we can, we want to provide enough resources, whatever those are, whatever those limiting factors are, we want to provide enough resources so that we're not the cause of lowering that carrying capacity, if you will. So, for instance, for wintering waterfowl, we often use food. We often think about food as an important factor. We have space and sanctuary and other things, but food is an important factor for wintering waterfowl. There's very large populations in the fall. You know, we have millions and millions of waterfowl that use the Southeast every year, migrate here for 3, 4, even 5 months, depending on the species that they're gonna spend that amount of time here. So that's a lot of mouths to feed, and so we want to make sure that on refuges and in kind of complementing our partners and private lands and our state agencies, that we provide enough food so that the food is not a limiting factor as much as possible for waterfowl. We want to have large populations go back north in the spring so that they can initiate nests, and then we can have a big fall flight again next year.
Within waterfowl, we'll kind of shift here to be more specific on waterfowl here as we go forward. But within this idea of carrying capacity, how much of a given resource do we need to support population of a certain size? And we know what that limiting resource is. And there's this idea of a food limitation hypothesis as it relates to the basis of our bioenergetic modeling for waterfowl during the non-breeding season, basically saying that for the most part of all the things that we think that waterfowl go through during the non-breeding season, we believe the one that is most likely to be constraining, have the potential to be constraining, is food. So that kind of takes us to the reason why for the past 40 or so years, there has been a great deal of research into foraging ecology of waterfowl. And foraging ecology itself, the study of how and why and where animals eat, where they feed, that's a really rich literature, even well beyond waterfowl, and it's pretty fascinating to dig into the details. But this idea that food is potentially limiting during the non-breeding season is why we've invested so much in understanding the resources available in different habitat types, how we can maximize resources available in different habitat types, and then we kind of work all that into our conservation planning so we can figure out for a given population objective how much food we need, and if we know how much food is in a different habitat type, we know we can then kind of translate that to what are our habitat objectives for a given type of habitat there. So foraging ecology has been something you've had an interest in. I've had an interest in. I will encourage people to go back and listen to that episode that I referenced earlier from season 3, episode 17, because it provides some of the background for what we're going to talk about here with regard to bioenergetic models as the basis for conservation planning. But I want to give you, Heath, an opportunity to take your stab at describing that. So how do we take this understanding of carrying capacity, food as a potentially limiting factor, and then to our bioenergetic modeling?
That's a good question. So from a high level, it's actually kind of simple, but the devil is in the details, and each one of those components of that bioenergetics model can take years and years and many graduate students to figure out what those individual parameters are. So sort of at a high level, like you mentioned, we want to make sure that we have enough food for the number of let's say waterfowl that come to our area of interest, like the Southeast. So we want to make sure that food is not limiting. We acknowledge that there can be many other things that will limit that population, potentially a dry summer in the prairie, so breeding habitat. There may be things that they encounter on migration. There are things very much out of our control that we can't do anything about, that may also affect the populations. But one thing we have at least some control over is the amount of food that we provide on the landscape and how we allow birds to access that food. And so it is one of probably our one of our better conservation planning metrics. And so what we do is we essentially figure out how much food that or how many birds that we need to feed. All right, and then based on how many calories, so the daily energetic requirements of each one of those birds, so we can figure that out. Then we know how much what or the total calories we need to feed. We figure out how many wetlands are on the landscape, what kind of wetlands there are, how much food is in each one of those wetlands. Obviously, rice has a different amount of calories in it than does a deep water lake, for instance. And so we figure out that, and then we see if there's any difference in those. So do we have enough calories just naturally on the landscape, or do we need to provide extra by doing habitat management? And as you may be guessing, or the listeners may be guessing, because we've lost tons of wetlands in the southeast and actually across most of the U.S., we generally find that we have more mouths to feed than we have natural calories available, or calories available in natural wetlands, which is why we manage on national wildlife refuges, WMAs, even private lands, why they provide extra food. They plant crops, they manage moist soil vegetation intensively to provide a bunch of food so that we have enough food, or we at least as much food as possible to feed all those ducks if they show up in the winter.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, it gets pretty complicated whenever we dig into these models, because basically what we're trying to do with our modeling is replicate the process by which birds utilize these habitats. The decisions that we make, the models that we have in place to do the calculations that you talked about, how much habitat do we need to support X number of ducks, it depends on our thinking and the way we've constructed those models, accurately representing the way ducks make decisions, right? And so that's where a lot of our science investments have gone to kind of understand, and that's where this foraging behavior, foraging ecology comes into play, is if the assumptions we're making about how birds select habitats, use habitats, the type of foods that they consume in those habitat types, if we're wrong on any of those assumptions, then our calculations of the amount of habitat and where that habitat needs to be to support those populations is going to be off, right?
That's right.
So that's some of my research. My PhD research investigated that in the upper Midwest. You did the same for your PhD research at Mississippi State. And the gist of it is that, or at least for one of the research questions that you and I both tried to address, is the basic assumption that birds are going to use habitats differentially based on, or I should say, in proportion to the amount of food that's available in them, right? That's one of the basic assumptions, right? And so then there's this other issue that you looked into in depth of what's the point at which birds stop foraging in a wetland, foraging threshold, or giving up density? Which do you prefer?
When we're talking about the response of birds, giving up density is the right metric. Yeah.
Okay, so tell us what that is. And we're trying. You have two scientists on here, and we're trying to keep it non-technical. So what's a giving up density?
That's
it's
right.
a challenge. It's probably the greatest challenge that we're going to have here in this podcast.
Two scientists that have taken way more samples in wetlands than we need to discuss here.
Exactly.
That's right. Giving up density, real simply, is the point at which foragers abandon an area and move somewhere else. So we'll keep this in the waterfowl world. So if we think about a bunch of dabbling ducks using a wetland, they generally will come in right after that wetland is available in early winter. So right after you flood a wetland, there may be hundreds, thousands of birds that come in and use that wetland, and they may use it for a week, a few days, a month or so. Generally, though, they're going to move on and go somewhere else. And so at that point, when most of those foragers make that decision to stop foraging there and to physically move to a different wetland, that's sort of what you can think about as a giving up density. At what point did they give up? It just wasn't worth it anymore. What's interesting is that that's not a static number, because the landscape changes throughout winter. You get rainfall, you get the impoundments being drained or filled up. You get more food becoming available, less food becoming available. The weather changes, the number of foragers, the number of birds that changes, and so you can actually sort of go through cycles. I think many of the listeners, if they're duck hunters, will have seen this probably, where you're not sure why all the birds left a week ago, and you're not exactly sure why they all came back today. But food resources, not only in your wetland, but with respect to the changing conditions around them, make a huge difference in the choices that those birds are making in where to forage. And so how we sort of index that are those bird responses. So that's, I guess, as simply as I can put giving up density, Mike.
Yeah, well, thanks. And as you did mention, I hope we're able to kind of paint a picture of some of these concepts in a way that our listeners can relate to them. And as you mentioned, I think a lot of our listeners are going to be hunters. A lot of folks will have access to, they may manage their own properties, and they may, I know if we're talking about some of the rice landscapes, they're going to, and if they're duck hunters, they're going to be nervous about early flocks of geese coming in, landing in their field and eating all the rice seed before the ducks come down, right? I've had Dr. Tom Mormon was talking about a rice field that he had access to a few years ago, and early on in the season, geese showed up, and I think the term he used was goosed. I was goosed. They ate all my food. So that concept there, where you have geese in this case come in, eat all the rice seed, and then people are disappointed because there's nothing left for the ducks. I mean, and so the reason they're disappointed there is it's this basic concept of there is a point at which there may still be some food there, but it's not worth the ducks' energy to come and try to find that food, right? And so that's kind of how we can relate to it in terms of what we see in terms of a bird response.
Absolutely. So giving up density, we're sort of thinking about the density of foods at which ducks abandoned. Another thing, and this is again getting a bit technical, but you think about these bioenergetics models, and what we're really looking for there is a little bit different of a foraging threshold. We some people have called it a critical food density. There are various names for it, but that's a little bit different. That's that sort of absolute minimum density of food at which it is no longer worthwhile for a duck, for instance, to come in there because they're going to spend as much energy foraging for that, looking for those seeds, looking for those grains as they get back out of it. So think about the end of winter. The rice has been underwater for a long time, for instance, in Arkansas, if you're in a rice field. So there's been some decomposition. Geese have been in there. They might have buried some of the seeds. So there's still some food there, but it's hard to get at. There's a lot of friction there for a duck trying to find it. They can't see under the water. The water's all dirty from all the geese that have been in there. And so that density is sort of what we think about as a critical food density. And that's what we like to use in bioenergetics models. That's that break even point where it's just too much energy for a bird to go find that seed in a wetland as it is. So they just don't get anything for that expended energy.
And so from an application standpoint within that model, what we do is if we can identify that threshold value, whatever it is, 50 kilograms, or if it's 180 kilograms per hectare, that's the number that we basically subtract off from our estimate of total food available in a given habitat type, right? Because we have to assume that once it gets down below that level, it's not going to be energetically profitable to access, to acquire, right? And then that would be the application of a foraging threshold within our bioenergetic modeling. Okay, Heath, so I want to try to make this a little less technical. Greatest challenge that I face in being a host on this thing is trying to make things less technical. But I know you have a great analogy to use here to help explain this concept of foraging threshold or foraging profitability, or how you just kind of think about how ducks perceive a certain environment and the profitability of it relative to the amount of food there and the other things that are happening around it. I've heard you describe or use an analogy related to maybe the Golden Corral buffet or something like that to help convey this. So tell us what's going on here.
That's a good one, or at least I like to go to it because people laugh when I go there. But sometimes I describe the foraging threshold similar for a duck in a rice wetland, for instance, similar to what probably many listeners have experienced at their favorite buffet with mac and cheese, right? So think about everyone get this mental image. And think about you've walked into your favorite, large buffet, and oh man, a football team just got done eating, or
the geese,
the geese, right? The geese. That was a bunch of little league teams, right? The geese, or whatever it is, right? So, or a big crowd just left, and so you're sort of you get your plate, and you're sort of wandering around, and you're trying to figure out which foraging patch is worth it for you.
Which tray?
That's right. That's exactly right. So foraging patch is a tray, and so you you see the prime rib or whatever over there, and you're like, yeah, maybe I'll get over there in a minute. So I've got some information, right? So that you have some information, just like the ducks have some information. But you walk by and you really like mac and cheese, you really like the rice, but it's sort of that crusted mac and cheese that's left around there after the football team
kind of burnt, stuck to the edges.
Yeah, that's it. So you could pick up the spoon and sort of scrape at the edges of that burned mac and cheese, but most people are not going to. Most people are going to move right along. They're going to go find a different foraging patch. They're going to go to the prime rib. They're going to go get some rolls, whatever, and they're going to wait for that to be replenished. And so that's sort of the same thing. All of that mac and cheese wasn't gone. It just wasn't worth me to deal with. I didn't want the leftovers. I didn't want the stuff that had been burned and foraged on for a long time, by the football team. And so that's sort of the same decisions that a duck has to make. They have to come along. They have to assess how much food is there. So they forage a lot. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting resources. They have to stick their head underwater. They have to sample. They have to figure out how much food is there, what kind of food is there. And then they may move right along at some point if there's not sufficient food resources for them to sit there and exploit that foraging patch.
And as people, we're able to assess the availability of resources just by looking at it, right? Because you were able to look at the tray and you're actually able to look over at the prime rib. And so you have that you're closer to this perfect knowledge of what all my resources are. But you make a great point. Ducks can't do that. They can't necessarily see what's down there under the water in the mud. They have to sample, they have to dabble, and they have to, and they can't necessarily see what's in that other wetland over there. So it's a little more challenging for them, right?
It is. I need to change my analogy. I hadn't thought about that, but it's a
blindfolded.
Yeah. That's it. That next time I use that, it'll be a blindfolded experience.
And so that would be a foraging decision situation in which the decision is made only based on how much food is there, what we're seeing, what we're assessing in terms of the amount of food that is there, and what it costs kind of energetically to acquire it, how much time and energy it takes to scrape off the mac and cheese. And there's kind of an opportunity cost there. If you spend too much time trying to scrape off the mac and cheese, you're going to be foregoing those other opportunities. Somebody else might get to it first for the prime rib or a big roll or whatever. Now, that's only if we have food that is the basis for that decision. What if we have a group of people over in the corner that's making a lot of noise, that are creating a very distracting environment? And let's say there's a lot of people moving around and it's just very uncomfortable. Is that going to change our decision, perhaps?
100%. So you think about this, and we're going back to our buffet. What if it's a crowded buffet and there's a whole lot going on? People are throwing elbows. There's a new tray of mac and cheese out there, and they're going after it. That may influence your decision. You may really like mac and cheese, but it's just not worth the fight and the 5-minute wait to get it right now. So I'm gonna move along. I might even have some broccoli today. I might do something healthy. Clearly, Mike, I need to have some more broccoli. But we may make different decisions based on other things that's going around. So how does that translate to a duck foraging in a natural wetland? Well, there may be hunting. There may be predation pressures that aren't hunting related, like eagles flying around. There may be a whole lot of other birds that just are physically in the same space as that bird, and that may make them want to spread out because they've got a mate with them, and they don't want that much pressure. They want to physically spread out, like with mallards in the middle of winter. So you get all these other things going on that sort of complicates our interpretation of how birds respond to food resources. So food resources are certainly one driver of how birds use wetlands, but they're not the only thing. It's a whole bunch of different factors that just like when you go to the buffet, a whole lot of things are affecting which patch you choose to forage in. The same thing for ducks.
And maybe one of your old nemesis walked in the door and he's been looking for you and going to rough you up. You're probably going to get out of there, right? That would be sort of the analogy on the type of disturbance or risk that hunters are posing to waterfowl. And we've talked about this on previous episodes of how it's explaining why ducks are where they are. And even at like local scales, regional scales, it's complicated. It's never single factor. It's disturbance, it's pressure. That's kind of what we're talking about here with your nemesis walking in. You see him, I'm going to get out of here, or the disturbance, the noise. It's also the amount of food that you're seeing there, and these things kind of interact. It's also weather. I mean, if it's super hot in that Golden Corral, their air conditioner broke, you're not going to want to really stick around to endure the sweaty, uncomfortable environment. And then let's add to that, what else is across the parking lot? Let's say there's another restaurant over there and you can see in it and there's not a lot of people there, but you're able to see that they've got a lot of food out there. That's going to influence your decision also, right?
100%. What other options you have on the landscape? So what other wetlands a duck has within a few miles, easy for them to fly around. They've got a general sense of probably what's in that landscape around them for a couple of miles. So and those things are changing over time. So that's super important to inform the decisions of ducks, and we sort of call those opportunity costs. So again, not to get too technical, but those opportunity costs is there an actual cost to me not going somewhere else? So if I choose to stay here, I don't have to fly over there to that other wetland, but ice cream machine might be working across the road.
Or the
right
peach
over
cobbler.
there. They have peach cobbler over there. So there's a cost to me not getting up and flying over there. And so birds have to grapple with those decisions. And what we've tried to do, and I think both of our studies and some other folks try to do is, not just look at the bird response, but measured the food over time to see how those two things lined up, and sometimes how they didn't. It's interesting that all sorts of different things affect bird movement and bird behavior. Food is one of them, but so sometimes you don't get the response that you expected when you measure that food over time.
So you're trying to provide a transition so we can start talking about your research and some of the other aspects of this, and trying to take us away from a discussion of peach cobbler and ice cream and piping hot coffee that would kind of moderate the effect of some of these other things, right? So because all that comes into play. But let's do transition here to your research, where it was really interesting PhD research where you tried to really dial in on some of these assumptions related to foraging thresholds and how birds and different densities of food, I should say, in different patches, and how birds respond to those. So give us the high-level view of what your PhD research was, kind of in the context of what we've talked about here.
Sure. I looked at a variety of different things for my PhD. The one that's most related to this was an experiment where we manipulated the amount of food that was on the landscape primarily in late winter. What people had done before, and what some other portions of my work were just to simply track bird responses and track food responses over winter. So we started when the birds showed up in early November, we started sampling the food resources, and we sampled all the way through early March, tracked the bird response. So that's one great way, but you don't have control of how much food you're putting out. Different sites have different kinds of food, and all of that influences the decisions of the foragers.
And that was the type of research, the type of study design, you might say, that I had for my PhD. I measured the amount of food in these different wetlands and then looked at bird response and tried to assess whether the bird response matched the amount of food in those wetlands.
Absolutely. And I did that across most of the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, large-scale study for a variety of other reasons. And so that was part of it. But then we had that generated some additional questions when we were sort of scratching our head. Why weren't the birds responding in that study like we would have predicted them to?
There wasn't we didn't have that linear relationship between duck use and amount of food that would theoretically be needed to support that number of ducks, right?
That's correct. And we worked mainly in waterfowl sanctuaries. They're areas where there's low disturbance from humans anyway. There's no hunting allowed right there or immediately adjacent. And so we should have really limited some of those factors that would have changed, that would have varied among sites and would have changed the bird response. But we still saw some really unexpected differences in how much food, in those patterns of food utilization, how far down really the birds were able to take the food. In some wetlands where there were lots of ducks, they ate half the food. In other ones, they ate, 9/10 of the food. What was driving that? And so what we did is we designed a little experiment in late winter to supplementally put out 3 different known densities of food. We used Japanese millet, as I recall, and we had sort of a low density, what we thought was approximately the foraging threshold in rice fields at 50 kilograms per hectare, about 50 or 60 pounds per acre of food. And then we had a moderate value, and then we had a treatment with a lot of food out there. And what we saw was a bit unexpected. What we saw was that for the first few weeks, when birds probably could sort of perceive those differences, they did act like we expected them to. There were more birds in that really heavy treatment where there was lots of food than the one with not very much, although there weren't as big a differences as there should have been. For instance, the birds sort of overutilized the low density treatments and underutilized the high density treatments. And then we were really surprised how quickly the birds removed the amount of food that we put on the landscape. We thought we were putting a whole lot of food out there, and it was, in small treatment areas, but we put a whole lot of food on the landscape, and 100 birds could show up, and in a few days they could basically change their functional response. They could eat a whole lot very quickly, and really what then we saw was that food level in most of those wetlands sort of dropped to a consistent level for the rest of winter, but the bird use continued to change, which probably was a reflection of what was going on in the rest of the landscape. More food becoming available, less food becoming available. And so what we saw in our treatment plots were birds sort of coming in and out, foraging at different rates, but it wasn't driven by the food we had there necessarily. It was a combination of what was in those treatment plots and the rest of the landscape.
So one of the things, if I understand correctly, is that the birds came in these different treatment units, and they foraged, and they took all the food down to a pretty common level across those different patches, which started with different levels of food. And ordinarily we would say, okay, well, that should be the giving up density, right? That we would think that might be the point at which
the birds would leave.
Yeah,
correct.
but they didn't.
They didn't.
Right? So what was going on there? How did you interpret that?
Not only did they not leave, they didn't stop foraging.
As indicated by observations of their foraging behavior.
Right. We set in blinds. We spent hundreds of hours, probably thousands of hours going across all these treatment sites and sitting in blinds, looking at birds through binoculars and figuring out what their activity levels were. Were they foraging? Were they swimming around? Not foraging? Were they engaged in social activities? A variety of different things that we looked at. And what we found was that the actual percentage of the birds or the proportion of the birds that foraged stayed relatively consistent across time periods. So no matter how much food we had out there, and for the most part, no matter what treatment those birds were in, low food, high food, about half of them were foraging at any given time until late winter. Now, in late winter, in February, we had lower numbers, but the proportion picked up. I think the birds are probably hungry, preparing for spring migration. But what was interesting is that we were not able to demonstrate that giving up density as far as bird responses. So
in terms of them leaving.
That's right. They wouldn't leave. and even when they were still there, they continued to sample in the wetland. They continued to forage. And that was a bit unexpected for us. What we sort of, our interpretation was that, of course, we were working in bird sanctuaries, and so it's a safe place during the day. I should clarify, these are all diurnal or daily observations. But those birds were in a safe place. They probably could go elsewhere at night and fulfill their large energy requirements. And so they were just using sort of that safe place during the day, maybe grabbing a few invertebrates, picking up a few seeds here and there. But really what they were doing is sort of moving around the landscape with respect to what else was going on outside our treatment plots, rather than anything we could control inside those.
Do you think it's also maybe, so when they're going back to our analogy or Golden Corral analogy, it's a place where there might not have been they may have been sampling, not finding a lot of food, but they also were not being disturbed. And they did know from their exploits out across the broader landscape that there was disturbance in some of those other areas. So is that's probably what you're saying might be going on. And then in terms of the foraging behavior that you saw, do we know what would be really cool, I know you don't have the I know you didn't do this, but it'd be really cool to study the individuals that are doing that repeated foraging, and then how would those differ from the ones that may not have been if there were any differences in kind of individual foraging behavior. But you didn't have that information, did you?
We did not. That would have been amazing to have a large-scale transmitter study going on at the same time, or even being able to collect some of these individuals and see what they're eating. They're sampling a bunch in this wetland. We sat there for an hour and watched them, but we couldn't detect. But when we went back and took food samples, we couldn't detect that they had actually removed a significant amount of seeds. And
you didn't collect any of the birds to see what they were eating.
Correct.
And so were the ones that were foraging and not getting anything, were they young birds? Were they in poor condition? You don't have any of it.
We don't have any of that information. So sort of what we made out of that is that we sort of have to be cautious trying to predict food densities using only bird numbers, because it's, especially in sanctuaries, it's just much more complicated than that. There are many other factors on the landscape that drive distribution, abundance, and foraging rates, and the things going on around your wetland, especially at that larger landscape scale, hugely important in determining how many birds you have and what they're doing and when they get there. So that means that sometimes we can, as duck hunters, we can scratch our heads. I have set the table, I have the perfect conditions, but it may be that everyone around you has also set the table, and so there's not a lot of marginal difference between those different food patches, and it's not really driving them to yours or driving them away from yours. And so it's just much more complicated to try to predict bird abundance and behavior with food than what we initially thought.
And we talked earlier about the role of disturbance and noisy environments in affecting decisions relative to foraging or anything else. And in theory, you could have incorporated some disturbance into your study. Now, I think your sites were, I don't know if the spatial arrangement of the sites would have allowed you to kind of isolate that disturbance. But you could have, that's sort of the natural extension of our conversation relative to your observation that birds are still there, but they're not further depleting the food resource. What are they going to do if all of a sudden there's a big disturbance? Would that then activate the quote giving up density so that they actually do leave?
That's a great point. This was sort of, from a bird's perspective, the optimal place to go sit and hang out, right? There's not a lot of pressure, some eagles, some natural predators, but it's generally a safe place for these birds. If we had replicated this in an area that we could have done experimental disturbance or that was hunted or something, then I suspect we would have seen something very, very different. And there have been studies that have followed up, right? So science is a bunch of stair steps, right? And so there are folks that have followed up on my research, actually Adam Bainey in Illinois, and they looked during spring migration. They looked at some different distances to trees and to cattail lines, sort of surrogates for predation risk, how far foraging patches were away from predation risk, and they were able to demonstrate some differences in how those factors, and really quantify with bird response how those factors laid in to that food use.
So the observation that you had birds that were staying in the wetland and continuing to forage, although not really getting no indication they were getting any food from that, led you, and let's see, your research partner there was a gentleman by the name of Kaminsky. Is that right?
I think Rick Kaminsky. That's right.
Rick Kaminsky.
Dr.
His
Rick
name
Kaminsky.
is familiar. Oh yeah, that's right. I know Rick. I actually talked to him yesterday. So yes, so it led you to sort of coin a term, foraging availability threshold. Is that right? And so that's different from a giving up density.
It is, right. So giving up density, that's something that actually can tell us a little bit about predation risk and sort of these other factors in the landscape, maybe more so than tells us about the energetic profitability. So it gives us a relative measure of that, but not an absolute measure. And so when we were talking about a threshold, a critical food density, or that sort of critical threshold, or the buffet example, we're talking about there's not enough energy. It's not worth my time to scrape the bottom of the bowl. And so through through a sort of this experiment and some others, that's really what we've tried to find for energetic carrying capacity models, right? So for the bioenergetics models, because the bird response, especially in sanctuaries, is varies with so many other things, we had to think a little bit differently and not just try to use when birds left an area as an indicator. Okay, there's not enough food there. Sometimes that's probably correct, but other times we've seen that birds leave when there's more food there because there was maybe more food on the other part of the landscape. That's right.
Maybe a riverbank overflowed.
That's right. And so then it's like, oh, well, that's too high. That actually had nothing to do with foraging profitability. It had to do with opportunity cost in the landscape. In my study, the birds never left really. And so, even though it was certainly not profitable for them to keep foraging there. And so that density is too low. And so what we've done in other studies is try to zero in on that critical food density, that forage availability threshold for use in energetic models. And what we found is that that's probably different for different species. It should be. It's for moist soil wetlands. Some of the research now indicates it's probably much higher than it is for rice fields. It also, this is interesting, it gets complicated, but it probably is very different for a green-winged teal than for a mallard as compared to a snow goose, for instance. And so when you're thinking about these quote unquote relatively simple, I think is how I put it earlier, bioenergetics models, as I said, the devil is in the details. And so, yeah, we can grab a number real quick and put it in there and move on with our life. But when these army of graduate students begin trying to test all these assumptions, what we found is that it's actually much more complicated than what we initially thought.
Yeah, and so the listener may be thinking, all right, well, you have these assumptions in your model, you test them, and they don't hold up. So what do you do? Well, we adjust the model as best we can, but then we also look forward to a different type of model that might enable us to better capture some of these dynamic activities and the spatial orientation, spatial distribution of habitats on the landscape. And ideally, if we had some index of disturbance on the landscape and understood how birds responded to those different things both during the day and at night, then maybe that's the next generation of bioenergetic models. And well, guess what? There are some people that are actually working on these spatially explicit, landscape-based, individual-based models is what I was struggling to come up with the term there. But these agent-based models, individual-based models, where they are modeling the behaviors of quote digital ducks, based on our understanding. Our empirical understanding of how waterfowl behave and respond to these different things. And so I don't know if you're involved in any of that yet, but I know you're aware of it.
I'm aware of it. I've worked with a couple of folks, and we've built a very simple individual-based model for SCOP actually in the Midwest, and it's as you would think, it's super complicated, right? We've transitioned from paper ducks, as we like to joke about in our world, to electronic ducks, and you have to have so many more parameters, right? Think about how this simulation might work, where ducks are moving around the landscape and they move into a cell and there's pressure, and you have to predict or build in the model how they're going to respond to that, and are they going to forage, or are they going to move and then forage? So a million different things go on, and it's a bit mind-boggling to think about. But there are some folks that are way smarter than I am, and they're making some really nice advances with that. And I agree with you, Mike. I think that's going to be the next iteration of bioenergetic models, and we're going to learn a lot when we can build those things more efficiently when they become available for more species.
And some of the work that we spoke with you previously about in terms of how the National Wildlife Refuge System allocates its sanctuary or manages its sanctuary spatially, and how much, and that would be that's where that really comes into play, because that spatial, those types of new models would accommodate the spatial orientation, spatial configuration, and juxtaposition of all these different types of habitats.
100%. That is super exciting for us, because then we transition from having to sort of only think about the food and ignore everything else, because analytically that's sort of all we can handle, to thinking about all of these different factors in combination. And sure, we're trying to figure out how ducks feed and in how much food they remove, and so we can put enough habitat on the ground. But also we can think about the same time how they respond to disturbance, even in this simulated way, and that's going to tell us much more we need to know for sanctuary management on refuges.
We're going to start wrapping this up. I have one question related to this, but it's going to be sort of a hard left, slight left turn.
Okay.
But I want to ask it before we get out here. But the other thing that I'll say at this point to our listeners, while you're trying to digest all of the terms and all the scientific mumbo jumbo that Heath and I have tried to avoid, but invariably we're unable to avoid. We did incorporate, if there's any aspect of this conversation that you have questions about or want us to elaborate on, hey, drop us a line, dupodcast@ducks.org. Heath is local. He's easy to get a hold of and would be happy to, I think he'd be happy to come back and revisit any of these topics or tangential or whatever in more detail. So the related question that I wanted to end on with here, and it's something I had written down and I want to make sure I ask, what do we know about how waterfowl forage on individuals' seeds? We didn't, and different types of seeds, we didn't even get into that aspect of your research and some of the other work that you conducted documenting all the different types of moist soil seeds in these, or natural seeds in these moist soil wetlands. You look at a rice field, most of it's going to be rice seed, and so in a more natural type of wetland, there's a plethora of different seeds and other tubers, rootstocks, and they differ in size, they differ in nutritional content. But what do we know about how waterfowl forage on those different food items? Do they specialize? Do they get in there and, let's just say, only feed on the macaroni? Or do they take the broccoli, if you have a big plate of broccoli and macaroni and cheese and whatever other kind of food item you want to throw in there, and do they indiscriminately forage off of that?
Great series of questions there. And the short answer is we know a lot less than we maybe thought we knew. When you start to dig into it, we've had lots of studies over the last, from the late 1930s through the late 1980s. We had lots of studies across the U.S. that have looked at food use by ducks. What do they eat? So what's in the birds? And so we have actually a really complete picture of the number of different things that they eat and, the relative number of occurrence, right? So are there a lot of millet seeds? Are there a lot of rice seeds? So on and so forth. What we really don't have that much of are these nice selection studies where we've measured how much is available in the wetland. We've then collected birds that were feeding in that wetland after we watched them feed there, and we've compared the ratios of what they had, in their digestive tracts with what's in the wetland. We are getting more of those studies. The Fish and Wildlife Service has funded a couple of those lately, and some of our partners have funded those. And so we're starting to get a picture of how much these individual species and even cohorts within the species, young versus older birds, males versus females, forage differently and probably perceive those. One challenge to your analogy there is, I'm challenged to know if a bird sees a seed, if it sees macaroni and cheese, or if it sees broccoli. I don't know.
Can it tell that? Can it?
Right.
I mean, it has to be able to. For some of these, it has some tactile sensory abilities on its bill. But to what degree do they act on that and depend on it? Right.
Absolutely. So it's challenging for us to know exactly how they perceive these, but we are getting better. So there have been some recent studies that are super interesting. One we completed a few years ago on green-winged teal. Sam Klimas, one of my graduate students, worked on that one, and some perplexing things. I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but I think the teal were avoiding millet, which we think is one of the best waterfowl foods on the planet, best natural foods on the planet. But they were eating millet, but they were selecting for much smaller species, red root flat sedge, a variety of others.
Which is pretty incredible. How can
they do that?
Yeah.
Right. So for our listeners that aren't familiar, it's a tiny seed, not quite microscopic, but extremely small. And for a green-winged teal to stick its head underwater, presumably where they can't see, they are foraging tactily, so they're grabbing bits of dirt and detritus and kind of kind of biting down on those, sucking the water, sucking that through their lamellae, through the comb-like structures in their bill, to try to imagine that they're selecting for different seeds, especially really small ones, is sort of mind-blowing. But that's what our study found, and it looks like we're seeing some similar sorts of things in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So there's a study that's wrapping up at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, and they've collected mallards and green-winged teal and northern pintail, and we're looking at asking the same sorts of questions. Are they all eating the same thing, or are they eating and selecting different food items? And so when we get the results of that study and a few other ones, it's going to help us as managers, as habitat managers, as sort of consultants to our refuge managers and habitat managers, to say, hey, we've got a lot of, your dabbling duck use here is driven by green-winged teal. We need to think about small seeded species, because that's really what they're selecting for, versus if you're really managing for mallards, well, they will go after these but not these other species. And so we're getting better all the time, but as with anything else, it's super complicated, and we're trying to figure out how that affects management and how ultimately we can feed some of this stuff into bioenergetics models, which of course would be challenging.
And are there differences among individual birds? Are there some that are going to prefer the millet? Are there some that are going to prefer the smaller seeds? And so I'll leave you with this. This episode will probably be released as we're getting closer to Thanksgiving. So while you all are sitting around your Thanksgiving table, you can look around at all your family members and see who among you are the ones that takes your food and mixes it all together and eats it, or which is the one that sequentially eats the little pile of mashed potatoes or turkey, or which are the ones that kind of mix it up. They'll take a bite of turkey, they'll take a bite of sweet potato, or whatever else. So what are the different foragers that you have at your table?
That's right. The folks who mix the mashed potatoes and the corn, you have them in your family. I do, right? And so you can do a little observation at Thanksgiving. I like that. Heath,
thank you so much. I could come up with a dozen more questions, and we could spend another hour talking about them. It's great to have you here with us. Thanks for spending your time sharing it with us, and for your expertise on this.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Heath Hagy with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System's Southeast Region. We greatly appreciate his time and sharing his expertise on this fascinating topic. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the great work that he does getting the podcast produced and out to you, our listener. And then to you, our listener, we thank you for your time and spending it with us here on the podcast, and we thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.